afternoon, everybody. We are here again with one more session of the study circle on an interesting topic concerning our constitution. I invite Mr. D. Srinivasan, advocate, to give his introduction address and welcome the speaker of the day.
Thank you, Senior Counsel Om Prakash sir. This is indeed a pleasant task to introduce the speaker, resource person of today. I would rather, in one word, would like to say on going through his qualifications and resume that I am glad and happy to introduce a young achiever, if I may say so. In this 33rd edition of our study circle meeting, it is indeed a pleasure for me and a privilege to introduce such a young achiever. He hails from Chennipalayam in Erode district. He had his early schooling at Erode and then completed his Bachelor's of Law degree from the School of Excellence in Law at Chennai. Besides this, his academic qualifications are much more. He has completed MA in Public Administration and MA in Criminology, both from the Madurai Kamaraj University. He has completed his ML in Criminal Law and another ML degree in Labor and Administrative Laws, one from the Madras Law College and other from the Madras University. Likewise, some of his other achievements are being a practicing advocate. He started his early career under the chambers of Sri M.M. Sundaresh, who was later on elevated as a judge of our Honorable High Court. Likewise, our resource person, Mr. Pratap, is a visiting professor in Annamalai University and also an assistant professor of law in Savita College of Law. He is also a visiting faculty in the Police Academy and has presented some 40 odd research papers so far. He has been a part of the team which he worked as a junior research consultant on the expert working committee under the CEMDS under the University of Natural Resource and Life Sciences, Vienna, Austria. With such achievements in the background, we are privileged to have him here. Over to you, Mr. Pratap, for the interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my respected senior. At the outset, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the study circle team and all the senior advocates and all the 11 advocates of Madras High Court for having invited me to deliver the most happening topic on the Constitution of India, which is a gray area indeed, I would rather say. It is the center-state relationship under the 7th schedule of the Constitution of India. Before going into the topic as such, I just give a brief summary about the nature and the structure of the Constitution as such. More particularly, as a political setup, how India was and how later on under the Constitution, the same came to be incorporated under various provisions. So when we talk about the structure of India as such, there are certain political structure, as I was pointing out, either a federal or a unitary setup. Now, in the words of Professor K.C. Weir, India as such country which is having the blend or a unique blend of both federal as well as unitary. That is why we have the government or a union government at the central having the parliament, and which is being controlled by way of legislative control, executive control, and so on, financial control, etc., which will be dealt in the later course of discussion today. Now, the center and state share that kind of a cordial relationship, or the powers which have been so categorically encapsulated within the provisions of the Constitution have to be distributed in such a way to have a strong relationship or a sound framework for the federation as such, which has been pointed out in the Constitution. Now, before going into the legislative background or the distribution of power as such in the Constitution, now how far the structure which is so being categorized in the Constitution have to be analyzed. Now, the Indian Constitution, which has been peculiarly following a system, pre-constitutional setup, I would rather say. Why I say the pre-constitutional setup? Because the sharing of powers or the center-state relations was not a new concept. Rather, it was followed even during the British regime. It was something, a different ideology which has made the makers or framers of the Constitution as such to incorporate verbatim the same provisions or the same hierarchy of distribution of powers. I was just referring to this particular pre-constitutional phase, which was borrowed exactly from the Government of India Act of 1935. Now, this was the first piece of legislation or first piece of enactment which rather describes the comprehensive enumeration of powers as such or the subjects which are within the domain of the respective legislative authority. So now, when Government of India Act was passed in 1935, it was the Governor General under the British regime who exercised his discretion, the administrative discretion as such, to describe these type of separation of powers or as such distribution of powers which is shared between the center as well as the states. Now, the very same concept was adopted while so in the year 1950 when the Constitution of India on the January 26, 1950 came into force. Now, the framers of the Constitution had thought to have that kind of a bonding or a center-state relationship as a strongest phenomenal factor for running a federal setup of government in India. So, which is why they have categorically separated or they have enlisted these powers or distribution of powers in the constitutional scheme under part number 11. So part 11 of the Constitution, more particularly, it covers about 11 articles. So part 11 comprising of 11 articles commencing from 245 to 255 and 256 more particularly. Out of these provisions, the union-state relationship are so being governed under the Constitution. So this is the first step ahead in achieving the center-state relationship as such. Now, this is not only the provision or part 11 is not to be read in isolation. Now, what has to be looked in is that the sharing of powers as such, I was just telling just before, the unique feature of Constitution by virtue of threefold distribution of powers or threefold distribution of subject under three different lists. This is the unique feature which none of the Constitution in the world has got except the Constitution of India. Now, the threefold distribution had categorically made such a wonderful separation, rather I could say it is the cordial legislative framework of relationship which has been so categorically given from part number 11, article 245 to 255. It has to be read in conjunction with the 7th schedule of the Constitution, which is the topic for discussion. So the 7th schedule, when we start talking about, it has categorically enlisted certain subject matters which have to be taken into consideration by the makers of law or the lawmakers as such while legislating a law on the particular subject. Say, for example, the three lists are there, namely list number 1 is called as union list, number 2 is the state list, and the third is the concurrent list. So now, when a law is being enacted, it has to be in principle followed that the sovereignty of these three organs or the list have to be the fundamental idea of the framers of law. Why I say this is the most precise way of demarcating the respective boundaries or the territorial limits, which we will be discussing later at the course of discussion today. So the demarcation of powers which has been given in the constitution per se has now started dividing the federal unit setup or the federation into their respective jurisdictional limit of lawmaking. So the lawmaking power with regard to any legislation is so governed within the framework of the constitutional scheme, which is categorically classified under the 3 list of the 7th schedule. So when a particular list or a subject matter which has been covered under a particular list is to be dealt with for the purpose of legislation, it is that which has to be taken into care or with circumspection. The lawmakers must dwell themselves into the respective domain of lawmaking power. So there is a limit with which the lawmaking bodies have to act while making a law insofar as the Constitution of India is concerned, which is categorically given the power distribution. Now, what is the reason for making such a kind of demarcation of legislative power? There are 2 fundamental reasons. 1, while defining the powers for lawmaking, the Constitution as such had defined the respective spheres of boundary of the authority of the legislative, executive, as well as the administrative functions. So as we all know, there are 3 different organs of the state, namely legislature, executive, judiciary. In a like manner, more akin to that, the boundaries of lawmaking or the legislative power would have a checks and balance or control insofar as the respective subject matters of the legislative entries so listed in the schedule number 7 of the Constitution. So this is the reason why Constitution has mandated for a demarcation of legislative power. So for the purpose of discussion today, we are now just taking into consideration only on the 7th schedule vis-a-vis the powers of legislative functions or legislative power assets. Why I am confining myself to the legislative powers? Because there are certain other functions or powers as such. Administrative powers are there, financial powers are there, so emergency powers. So all these things are there within these parts. So now for the purpose of discussion, we will confine ourselves to that provisions of the Constitution under part number 11 in relation to schedule number 7 of the Constitution, covering articles 245 to 256 as such. Now, as all well and explained here, the precise point for demarcation of this power has occasioned the Constitution of India to once again get into a larger perspective of conferring power sharing between those governments, namely the union government and that of the state government. Now, power sharing with regard to the legislative sphere with respect to a particular government. So now, insofar as the matters covered within one list, namely the union list, list number 1, it is the predominant power of the parliament, or parliament alone has got the supremacy to make a law. This is why we say parliamentary supremacy of making a law insofar exercising the power under list number 1 is concerned. Right. Now, where it comes to list number 2, It is the legislative field which is so occupied by the state alone, where parliament itself cannot encroach into the domain of the state legislature by saying that parliament can also exercise the powers in legislating matters enlisted under list number 2. Why? Because now there is a demarcation of powers which prohibits or prevents the union government from legislating a law in matters enlisted under state list. The only remedy is that the list number 3, which is given a leeway or which is given the hand for both the parliament as well parallelly to the state governments, in so far enacting a law, a parallel legislation, which we will be discussing with the help of legal doctrines, right? So the first part of discussion for today, I'll just start with the genesis or the background or historical background of this center-state relation, how it has evolved. Rather, I can put it in simple words, the evolution of center-state relation in the context of Indian Constitution. Now, the very demand for restructuring the Constitution or the center-state relationship had been gaining huge momentum since 1960s, later part of 1967, where there was a political shift and it has led to appointment of a committee which was preceded by the Administrative Reforms Commission in the year 1966, which has given a way for making out or establishing a strong union and state relationship. So the concept of union state relationship or center state relationship gained momentum at that point of time when the government of Tamil Nadu, which was pioneer in demanding for state autonomy, right? So this was the agenda which was put forth by the government, which was at the ruling government at that point of time in 1971, more particularly, which is reflected into the appointment of a particular commission or a committee, namely Justice Rajmanar Committee, which has been appointed by the government of Tamil Nadu then in 1971 for the exclusive purpose of restructuring the center-state relation, with special emphasis laying greater space for state autonomy. So now state is demanding for an autonomy or a state individuality or an independent legislative jurisdiction or administrative powers as such. So similar concerns were raised all over the country across the territory of India by all the states as such. Now this has eventually led in submitting of a detailed report by the Rajmanar Committee to the government of India as such, recommending for strengthening of center-state relations. Now already there were provisions under the Constitution, which I was just pointing out at part number 11, which is to be read in conjunction with schedule number 7, having the distribution of power under the 3 lists there. Now, what has been the outcome of this particular discussion, namely the report submitted by the Rajmanar Committee, is that the legislative provisions or the constitutional wisdom which was so imbued under Article 245 Class 1 was now the subject matter of discussion insofar as determining the center-state relations. Right. Now moving on to the constitutional provisions. Now we are entering into the exact topic for discussion today. What is the constitutional scheme of center-state relationship and that of territorial distribution of power? Why I am emphasizing on the word territorial distribution of powers? Because the center-state relationship is so predominantly determined based on the extent of limit of governance in that respective government or the authority. So center or the Parliament of India has got a power to legislate law for whole of the India or the entire territory of the India, right? This is under union list. Now when you come to state list, Now the territorial jurisdiction is so minimized or it is so confined within the bounds of the four walls or corners of the state as such. Why I say the territorial limits are so confined? Because when Article 245 confers the extent of territorial jurisdiction or the applicability of laws which were made by the Parliament, which is to apply it for or legislated for whole of the India or the whole part of the territory of Indian Union. So when we come to the legislative power as such distributed under Article 246, the very next article preceded by Article 245. So 245 has in generalia conferred the distribution of powers between Parliament and state legislatures. So this is how the center-state relationship have emanated into the constitutional perspective. Now we are just touching into the exact subject matters of law which the slide would rather go into. My discussion will be made very easier with the help of this particular thing. Thanks for sharing this slide. The bare text of the Constitution, when we read, now Article 245 Clause 1 of the Constitution, it has very particularly provided for the legislative limit of jurisdiction or the legislative power of the Parliament insofar making law to the whole of the territory of India. So that is why it's a subject to the provisions of this Constitution. Parliament may make laws for the whole or any part of the territory of India. Right. Now here it is very clear the center is having the predominant role in so far making a law. Now that is so being emphasized or it is so being categorically encapsulated within a particular doctrine which we will be discussing, the doctrine of predominant nature or dominant nature of the state, that we will be having at the later point of discussion with reference to Article 245. Now even going before into that doctrine of predominance, we must just take into consideration why this kind of the distribution of power is so being categorically given under Article 245 and that of 246, which is so being highlighted very particularly over there. Now, Article 245 simpliciter, it has conferred power on the Parliament to make laws for whole or any part of the territory of India. So by virtue of Article 245, it is very clear that the Parliament can make laws to the whole of India or it can also extend its power of lawmaking to all the states concerned. So state is also the subject matter of lawmaking insofar Article 245 is concerned. Now what is that which distinguishes Article 245 with that of 246? Now it is Article 245 which has made a different demarcation or categorization of the center-state relationship or power sharing as such. So the enumeration of power or the respective jurisdictional sharing of power is so justified in terms of Article 246. So I can put it in otherwise very simple. Article 245 is a generalia provision, whereas Article 246 is a specialibus provision. Why I stress as a specialibus provision? Because Article 245 per se says the extent of lawmaking of the Parliament insofar the whole of the territory of India. But when you come to Article 246, it has specially or specifically demarcated the division of powers within the territorial limits in conformity with the provisions of the Constitution, which is so been set under Article 245 as above. So the article which I was referring supra under 245 is now just fructified in terms of 246, where the subject matter is so being envisaged or it is so being elaborated in terms of different types of list under the schedule number 7. So this is the starting point of discussion or tip of the iceberg, which the discussion for today will commence from the lines of closer reading of Article 246. So when we just read verbatim et literatim understanding of Article 246, it is very clear that the respective jurisdiction of union and that of the state legislatures, and also the subjects or topics of exclusive legislation of lawmaking is envisaged thereunder in 246. So that is why I have pointed it is a special legal provision. It has specifically demarcated the jurisdiction. Not stopping with that, passing for a moment, it also exclusively conferred the power on the parliament to make a law with respect to the matters referred under list number 1 under 7th schedule. So union list whatever the laws that are made, which is the predominant power of the or exclusive domain of the parliament is concerned. Now when we just refer and read it to the next provision, 246 clause 2, this is the very emphasizing provision. It starts with a negative note or a non-obstante clause, as such we would refer. What is that non-obstante clause? Now, the non-obstante clause, namely notwithstanding anything, in clause number 3 of 246, the parliament may be subject to the preceding 246(1), or the legislature of the state also have the power to make laws insofar the matters enumerated under list number 3 of 7. Now the powers are shared here between in respect of the territoriality. Now I was just telling just prior, it is at this juncture one may have to just look into the provisions in conformity with Article 246 and that of 245. Now the legislative wisdom behind enacting of Article 245 is that it has been declared that whatever law that is being enacted by the parliament in terms of Article 245, it is subjected to the territoriality or territorial jurisdiction of distribution of powers, law-making powers, between the sharing of powers of parliament and that of the state legislature. Now that is so being ascertained, or it is fructified in terms of 246. Why? Because 246 is the governing provision which has given the territorial application. It says, now, if in case a particular law which has to be drafted or legislated by the state government concerned by virtue of subscribing to the powers under list number 2 of the 7th schedule. Upon 7th schedule, list number 2 is nothing but it is the state list. So it is the predominant purview or the privilege of the state to enact laws or legislations insofar as the matters enlisted thereunder. Right. Now, the state laws, if it is so being drafted and enacted, it must have the application of territorial limits of that particular state. So a state law is being enacted. Say for example, government of Tamil Nadu is making a law. That law will have its application only to the state of or territorial limits of Tamil Nadu concerned, or geographical angle or geographical boundaries of Tamil Nadu alone concerned. Now, if in case by virtue of the state law which is being enacted by reference to Article 246, now something is being enacted by the state law, if it is going to touch on some other state or the central law, if it is going to extend the scope of its application beyond its territoriality. Now this is the centrifugal point of discussion. Now I am just discussing. So the point I want to drive home is, now the concept of doctrine of a territorial nexus comes into picture. So this is one particular doctrine for constitutional interpretation insofar as interpreting Article 245 and 246 is concerned. Now what is that doctrine of territorial nexus says? It is very simple that whenever there is some connection or nexus between a particular law which is enacted by the state Now, if the state want to extend the application or scope of territoriality or territorial application beyond the state, now one thing has to be ensured or emphasized by the state, that is, what is the connection between the law made by the state or the nexus which is having the state-made law beyond the scope of its territorial application, and what is that object with which the state is going to achieve insofar extending the territoriality of that particular law beyond the territorial limits of the state is concerned. Say, for example, a state is making a law which is having application only to that particular state. Now, the state, if it wants to extend the provisions of the state-made law to the next state or a neighboring state, is it possible for the state legislature, first of all, to extend the scope of its territoriality by virtue of Article 246? Now, Article 246 makes it very clear, in case if a state law is being extending or it is so extended beyond the scope of its territoriality, now that is once again subject to judicial review of subject matter of challenge. So the constitutionality of such territorial extent of application will be tested insofar testing Article 246 by extending the scope of territoriality. The courts will resort to a particular doctrine called as doctrine of territorial nexus. So it is at this context the courts will now look into two things. One is there any sufficient connection between the state-made law? Number two, now if it is having a sufficient nexus or connection, now what is that object which the state is going to achieve or want to achieve by extending its scope of application or territoriality of application beyond the geographical limits of the state? So state government will be having its role or the play only within the four corners as I was just pointing. Now, over and above its territoriality, if a state is going to make a law, now what is that the state want to achieve? So this was so categorically discussed by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of State of Bombay versus RMDC. State of Bombay versus RMDC or RMD Chamar Bagwala, reported in AIR 1957, Supreme Court 699. So this was a case where a peculiar legislation, namely Prize Competition Act, was under challenge. So this was a law where Bombay, the Legislative Assembly of Bombay Maharashtra has enacted a Prize Competition Act prohibiting conducting of games based on chance or skill or all those things, right? So there comes a distinction by saying whether lottery or any other games which involves game of a skill or game of a chance are involved. Now, the government of Maharashtra had extended its application not only to the state of Bombay, it has blanket ban prohibited sale of lotteries or conducting of any prize competition games to the whole of Bombay and also in the neighboring states or people coming from the other parts of the neighboring state. Now, the subject matter of law was subjected to the question, or the constitutionality of this Prize Competition Act was under question in terms of Article 246. Now, Article 245 says generally Parliament is having a power as like state legislature is having a power within the respective domain of lawmaking. 246 says in terms of matters conferred under 7th schedule under list number 2, the state government is capable of making a law. Now, if the state government is making a law, whether that law can be physically made applicable to the territorial limits of that state alone, or if it could be extended to the neighboring state. Now, while testing this, you cannot just look in only on the geographical extent alone. Now, at this juncture, the Honorable Apex Court was in a position to propound a new concept of doctrine of territorial nexus, saying that now, while discussing the act under challenge, one must bear in mind that what is the reason for enacting that particular law by the state legislation or legislative assemblies. So the object of the law must be tested at the first instance. Number two, the nexus or the actual or real connection for that particular statute and the object which is sought to be achieved. So it is not only the territoriality which determines the jurisdiction of the state law to be constitutionally valid or making it otherwise nullified as null and void of divide of constitution as such under Article 246. It is over and above the territoriality, one must have in mind the object or the purpose for which that particular law was enacted must be taken into consideration. So it is not that only the territoriality alone have to be tested in terms of a conflict in a state law or under Article 246, extending the scope of a state law beyond the territoriality or extraterritorial operation. Over and above the application of territoriality, it is the actual nexus or connection that determines whether this law is a constitutionally valid or not. So this is the fundamental principle under which Article 246 of the Constitution is evolving, or the constitutional premise with which Article 246 is made to function insofar center-state relationship is concerned. Now, it was in yet another case 2 years later in 1959. It was in case of state of Bihar versus Charusila Das. State of Bihar versus Charusila Das, reported in AIR 1959, Supreme Court at page number 1002. Now, this particular case, the question before the court is that whether the state legislature has having the power to legislate any law with respect to the subject matter of religious trust or charitable trust, which is otherwise situated within the territory of the state, though it may be located physically within the territory of the state, its operation or the property of that particular trust or other legal entity may be either small or large in number, will be situated in the boundaries of other territory of the another state. So a trust is having property which has been administered within one particular state. The trust is so having properties, or religious charitable trust is having property also in a neighboring state. Whether a state legislature is competent enough to make a law to regulate the functioning of these type of trusts which are having extraterritorial operation or beyond the territoriality of operation of having function at 2 or more states. So that particular institution is not only functioning within the one particular state, it is so being function at 2 or 3 states parallelly. Now, taking the provisions under Article 246, now the state is competent enough or having the power to legislate by invoking the doctrine of territorial nexus. So at this juncture, the doctrine of territorial nexus plays a pivotal role in determining the scope of application of the law made under the state legislature by invoking the provisions or the powers under 246. So now 245 and 246 are having close nexus. Now the territoriality have to be decided solely within the premise of the touching provision of Article 246. So this is very clear. Now 245 and 246 have been drafted in the Constitution, keeping in mind to achieve this nexus or to have a simultaneous way of functioning to ensure a better center-state relationship. So this is how the starting note of center-state relationship is evolved in the constitutional jurisprudence. Now, moving back to Article 245 once again, and having a parallel analogy to part number 11 as well as the schedule number 7. Now, this is the yet another pivotal issue of discussion today. The distribution of law-making powers, how it is so been regulated within the framework of 7th schedule. So we all know the general provisions of 7th schedule. It categorically listed the subject matters under 3 lists. Now, what are all the items or subject matters of those 3 lists are also determined, where union list covering some 97 items. So if you have the bare text of the constitution, you may just look into the items which are so categorically enlisted under the list over there. Sir, you can just open the bare text of the constitution, enabling me to refer to items. 7th schedule. So the list number 1 of the constitution, it per se deals with 97 items under 7th schedule. So these are all within the predominant powers of the parliament as such, or the government of India as such, as it is so been vividly given under Article 246. So all these matters enlisting from item number, entry number 1 to entry number 97. So all the predominant subject matters dealing with defense, naval, foreign affairs, all right, foreign relations and government of Reserve Bank of India, banking, insurance, all these sectors we can just keep in mind. These are all coming within the exclusive statutory or governmental control of government of India, or rather I can put it in other ways, all these organs or instrumentalities of the government are government of India owned corporations or government of own India undertakings. So insofar as the subjects under union list is concerned, it is the predominant power or predominant will of the parliament which is going to decide what law have to be made or what is the fitting provision to make a law in so far items of 7th schedule under list number 1. So exclusive power of law making is being under the premise of parliament is concerned. Right. Now, the exhaustive list there under 7th schedule is moving on to the next item, 66 items under the state list, which is so been categorically given. So it starts with list number 2, entry number 1, starting with public order, police, prison. We can just imagine about the home department, the state government home department, the local government units, panchayats, municipalities, the most particular, the recent events of sharing of powers, which I will be discussing, right? Invoking of the 144 prohibitory order by Government of India, more particularly in terms of National Disaster Management Act in 2005, and the national level or the Government of India taking powers and it is making law for benefit of all the state in terms of emergency situation, which I will be discussing while I am dealing with the emergency provisions, right? So distribution of law making powers with that of the union list, state list and concurrent list have been given on the exhaustive 7th schedule. Now, what are all the subject matters which are not there being encapsulated, enlisted there under these 3 lists as aforementioned, are within the power of the residuary list. Now, this is the peculiar or fascinating issue which has been decided. So, these 3 lists are exclusive, where union list, state list and concurrent list, both parliament as well the state legislatures are competent enough to make a parallel law, which we will be discussing at the later point. Now, residuary subjects, which is the subject matter of discussion, it lists only one particular thing under Article 248 in terms of entry number 97, list number 1. What are all the matters which are not enumerated specifically either under list number 2 or under list number 3, including the matters of taxation, which are being defined under those 2 lists, are within the purview of residuary subjects, which are not being dealt under any part of the list under 7th schedule. So it is the residual subject of discussion, right? So Article 248 deals with the residual powers, and also entry number 97 of list number 1 confers exclusive power of the parliament to deal with those residuary powers. So it is not the predominant power of the state in so far dealing with residuary subjects. We should keep in mind that it is the exclusive domain of the parliament to make laws with respect to matters that are not specifically enumerated in any of the lists which are being categorically given under residual subjects. Right. Now coming directly to the very interesting aspect of interpretation of the Constitution insofar as the center-state relationship is concerned. The first doctrine is that, touching upon Article 246, is that the doctrine of plenary powers. So what is that plenary power? Is that Article 246 says once a particular topic or subject matter is being discussed or comprised or encompassed within any of the entries of the three lists, namely union, state or concurrent. Now, it is that respective legislature which is fully competent enough to enact a law on that respective subject matter, right? So, no other organ or body of the law-making authority is entrusted with the law-making power. So, for example, if a matter is enlisted under union list, it is the predominant power or plenary power of the parliament. By virtue of that plenary power, the parliament is having ample power or jurisdiction to make laws in so far that domain, and rest of the organs, namely the state government or state legislature, is being stopped or prohibited from encroaching into the domains of the parliament or the legislative body of the state government, shall not usurp the power of the parliament, or it should not rather encroach the powers of the domain of the parliament, which the parliament alone is fully competent to make a law. So this is how the law-making power is being so classified as part of interpretation, right? Now, what is that one more thing which is being discussed under the doctrine of plenary powers is that insofar 7th schedule is concerned. See, for example, the parliament is having power to make a law in respect of any particular entry in the list number 3. Forget about union list. It is insofar list number 3, concurrent list, where I was telling parallel law making power is vested on the state as well that of the center is concerned. Now, this so happened in case of state of West Bengal versus Union of India. State of West Bengal versus Union of India, AIR 1963, Supreme Court, page number 1241. Now, the parliament as having the power, it is in respect of that power, the government of India or the union is having the jurisdiction or legislative power to enact a law, right? Now, if a property which is so been situated in a particular state, whether the central government by virtue of a notification can acquire that property which is vested within a particular state government by exercising the power under entry number 42 of list number 3. So we say parliament has got power even also with reference to concurrent list. So it is a parallel law making. So the plenary powers vested with the parliament by virtue of the concurrent list under 7th schedule, very particularly an entry is so there. We can just refer to entry number 42, list number 3. So the bare text may be of use to refer at entry number 42, list number 3. So this is that particular entry which has provided a provision for making of laws insofar as acquisition of property or requisition of property. This was the original provision insofar as entry number 42, list 3. So this was the original entry which came to be subsequently amended, or the original entry is substituted by way of the present entry which was under challenge. What is that present entry is that authorizing the union government to acquire a land which is vested in a state government, right? So now whether a union or the government of India is empowered enough to acquire the land which is vested in a exclusive domain of the state government. Now the court has taken recourse to the doctrine which we were discussing as plenary powers, and the court has held more particularly the power of the government of India or union parliament insofar as property qua the subject matter covered under the concurrent list for acquisition cannot be obstructed by the state. Why? Because the plenary power is so predominantly confining power on the parliament as such. So the plenary power as such on the parliament, even in terms of matters enlisted under concurrent list, when it comes to discussion where the state and center can parallelly make a law, it is once again the predominant will of the parliament that prevail over the wish of the state government. So once again, the plenary provisions of power conferred upon the parliament that will be prevailing over the state government, and rather the legislative authority of the state government cannot usurp the power of the parliament, and it cannot encroach into the domain of the parliament even if the matter is being enlisted under list number 3, concurrent list is concerned. Right. This is once again being affirmed in terms of yet another rule which I'll just refer to, rule of union supremacy. This rule of union supremacy has got its roots once again under Article 246, reference to Schedule 7. Now, this rule of union supremacy says whatever matters that are within the domain of the parliament, it once again starts with a non-obstante clause saying notwithstanding, as we have referred to Article 246. So what is that fundamental principle which governs Article 246 or this particular doctrine which I was just referring to insofar rule of union supremacy is concerned? Very simple. Article 246 insofar union supremacy, it is based on the principle which implies that if there is any irreconcilable conflict or any overlapping between the entries in the 3 list with reference to the legislative power conferred upon the parliament under 246 and that of vis-a-vis the entries in union list, state list, concurrent list, it is the predominant will of the parliament that will prevail over the state legislatures, right? So if a subject that happened to be included in both lists, namely list number 1 and list number 2, so now the union legislature or parliament alone will be having the power to make a law once again. If it is so overlapping between the subject matter of the entries between list number 1 and 3, as I was pointing out, union list and concurrent list, it is not the concurrent list which will have prevalence, rather it is the union list by virtue of plenary powers or predominant powers, rule of union supremacy, which holds the parliament. That is why we often used to say the most powerful body or organ in the democratic setup is the Parliament of India. The Parliament of India is capable of making a law. It is capable of governing or the entire domain of lawmaking exclusively rest with the Parliament of India. So it predominates the will of the state legislature and it ascribes the power by virtue of Article 246, and its overlapping subject is there in case of any conflicting things. Just we will be just discussing in the later point of discussion. Right. Now, a practical example can be, a present day example can be just taken with reference to Article 246 insofar as this particular doctrine of the principle of union supremacy. The present context of the issue of NEET, national level entrance examination conducted by the government of India, and the states are making emphasis or pressure to withdraw the NEET examinations. Now, just we examine the legislative provisions under the ambit of Constitution. Now, to look into a larger perspective of legislative scope, list number 1 more particularly deals with the Parliament's power of making law in terms of entry number 63, 64 and 65. So you can just refer to, I'm just referring to 63, 64 and 65 of list number 1 of 7th schedule. Now entry number 63, it says institutions of national importance. Now it is, we all know, all national monumental importance are within the power of the Parliament. The Parliament has got more prevailing power to make a law. Now, when we come to 64, the specific provision is being embedded into the Constitution under entry 64, which categorically says the institutions for scientific, technical education, which is financed by Government of India and also declared by Parliament as institutions of national importance. This is how IITs, IIM, and all those institutions, AIMS, etc., NIMANS, all those institutions which are governed or funded are the instrumentalities of state, which we refer to Article 12 of the Constitution, which are deriving power by virtue of Article 246 in terms of list number 1 under 7th schedule, entry 64. Now, this is the governing provision. The center is playing a pivotal role or a predominant role, as I was telling. Even though we say there is a provision under concurrent list, right, which we will be discussing. Even though there is a provision, the provision under the union list is placed at a supremacy, or it is being placed at a predominant position, enabling the Parliament to decide on these subject matters, making a leeway for or giving a leverage for the Government of India to take the cudgels in its hand to decide upon the subject matters, even though the matters are concurrently governed or parallelly governed under list number 3 and entry number 25. So I am just drawing a parallel reading or analogy between entry number 64 of list number 1, and now I am just dwelling into list number 3 and entry number 25. So list number 3, concurrent list, also contains a provision in particular in terms of education, including technical education, medical education and universities. Now a rider is being provided once again here. What is that rider? Though power is being concurrently or parallel jurisdiction is conferred on the state under concurrent list, entry number 25, it is subjected to be governed by the provisions of entry number 63, 64, 65 and 66 of list number 1. So once again, the parliamentary control or the Government of India or Union government is playing the predominant position. So this particular entry in the concurrent list itself is being played, or it is placed under the supervisory jurisdiction, or we can say under the subject matter of legislative competence of the Parliament. So the state power or power of the state legislature is diminished, or it is being diminuted, or the value which is being attached with reference to this entry 25 is so being withered away by virtue of the preceding provisions which were being categorically given under entry 63 to 66 of the list 1. So that is why this kind of a issue, or this kind of a flaring up of the NEET issue, which is the burning or sensational issue, where the central or the Government of India is not coming forward to give complete autonomy or enabling the state government to parallelly take a decision on such a nature. So the matter has been very particular, Mr. Technical education or medical education. So it is all of professional educations which we can say. So it is all covering with universities and other subject matters. Right. Now coming to next facet of union list, state list and concurrent list in terms of list number 7. If there is a conflict between any of the subject matters falling within the purview of jurisdiction of the two lists, state list or the union list. Now, what is the methodology or modality adopted by the courts to resolve such a conflict? There are two entries which are coming into direct conflict. Entry number, there is a list number 1 and list number 2. Now, the court have to resolve such a conflict by just reading those provisions parallelly, closely. The construction of such a provision or the interpretation of such a provision must be construed so as to resolve such a conflict in a harmonious way. So at this juncture, it is that doctrine of harmonious construction which was propounded way back in the year 1963, in Gujarat University versus Krishna Ranganath Mudalkar. So Gujarat University versus Krishna Ranganath Mudalkar, reported in AIR 1963, Supreme Court 703, which was followed in yet another case, DAV College versus State of Punjab. DAV College versus State of Punjab, reported in AIR 1971, Supreme Court 1731. Now, what is that all harmonious construction or doctrine of harmonious construction is going to discuss? Now, whenever there is a conflict between one particular entry in the union list and the entry in the state list. Now, court says you cannot cut or sever or you cannot just remove these entries. Rather, you have to make out an adjustable understanding, or you have to make out a balanced approach. What is that balance? It says you have to interpret these provisions in together. It must be read in consonance with each other. It must not be read in isolation. So, if at all there is a conflict between any particular entry in the state list and that of the entries of the union list, now the court must adopt a pragmatic approach. It must devise that kind of a legislative interpretation so that these two provisions have to be provided or safeguarded or vouchsafed for the very purpose of making these two provisions exist parallelly in a harmonious way. So the same came to be affirmed by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of DAV College, which was reported in AIR 1971, Supreme Court 1731. The constitutionality or the validity of Punjab University Act of 1961 was challenged in this case. The short facts of the case is that the government of Punjab, the Department of Education, has decided to impart the medium of instruction and examination insofar as colleges, universities and schools as Punjabi as the compulsory language. So, by virtue of the powers which were conferred under the Parliament in list number 1 in entry number 66. So, we can just refer to entry number 66, right, of list number 1 of the 7th schedule. So, see, 66 of 7th schedule, list number 1 says coordination and determination of standards in institutions of higher education or research and scientific technical institutions. So, now what has happened? State has made a particular law within the state. It is the Punjab government which made the Punjab University Act prescribing Punjabi as the mandatory sole medium of instruction for examination in all the affiliated colleges of Punjab University. Now, Supreme Court has held categorically the legislative competence of the state is now devoid, or the legislative competence of the state government is now being excluded by virtue of the entry number 66 of list 1. You can just refer to the scrolling over here under 66, entry number 66. Why the court has come to that conclusion is that the ideology behind this judgment is that the legislative competence which is prescribed under list number 1 entry 66, it has more particularly said the matters that are enlisted under this, the fees in respect of any matters in this list, including the fees taken in any court, right? This is one particular aspect. And more particularly, when we talk about the union list entry number 66, it is coordination and determination, list number 1. This is list number 2, which I was reading. We are in terms of list number 1. That is the relevant provision to be discussed. 66 of list 1. He talks about the coordination and determination of standards in institutions for higher education or research and scientific and technical institutions. Right. So, as far as higher education institutions are concerned, it is the predominant power of the Parliament to determine such standards or to take any policy decision or to make out any law insofar vis-a-vis the powers under entry number 66 is concerned. But in the instant case, in DAV college case, what has happened is that the power has been usurped by the state government, deviating the provisions of entry number 66 of list number 1. So now the court has said the state has got no legislative competence to prescribe any such manner or medium of instruction in respect of higher education, which is the sole criteria for the exclusive domain of the lawmaking power of the union government or the parliament alone is concerned. So this is one particular doctrine. The next interesting doctrine under 7th schedule, center-state relationship, is the doctrine of pith and substance. We might have learned way back in interpretation of statutes. Now, what is that doctrine of pith and substance is all about? Now, what is the contextual application of this doctrine insofar determining the legislative competence of the legislature is concerned? See, for example, a particular law is being enacted. That law is challenged with reference to the entries in different list of the 7th schedule. Because of the reason, the law dealing with the subject within the competence of that particular legislation is incidentally or touching upon the subject matter of yet another list. There, for example, one particular matter is there dealt under union list. The very same subject matter, if it is so being encapsulated within state list, if now state is also making a parallel law, now it is opening a leeway for parallel law making, as I was just pointing out earlier. Now state is also making a parallel law. By virtue of making such a parallel legislation, though state law is now touching or encroaching, or it is now trying to take out the legislative power of the, usurp the power of the parliament concerned. Now, while deciding this particular issue, now court has to decide two particular instances or two particular parameters. Now, the first issue to be discussed is that whether the true character or nature of the legislation is in principle or is in substance in conformity with the competence of the legislature. So, if a law is being made, now what is the intention or the idea of that legislative body to make a law for that particular subject matter? So if a state government is making a law, legislative, the state government of Tamil Nadu is making a law on a particular subject matter. Now the government has to justify, the state legislature have to justify in terms of saying that, now this is the reason, this is the purpose or nature for which the legislature is making a law. Right? The true intention behind the enactment of the statute. This is what the exact verbatim of doctrine of pith and substance is all. Now this is one part of it. The second limb of pith and substance would go to say that if in case the legislature enacted a particular statute without assigning any reason for it, and if in such a case it incidentally trench or touch upon the matters beyond its legislative competence included within the concerned list of the 7th schedule. Now the court has to test the legislative competence of the particular lawmaking body vis-a-vis that of the true purpose or object or intention of the law which is to be made of all these lists concerned. Now, court must satisfy to test this particular lawmaking power or legislative competence by saying, to give effect to that particular law which is under challenge, the court must put in test one particular factum. The judicial wisdom must exercise by the court to determine whether out of these the three lists, what is the actual list which the subject matter is going to be dealt. Yeah, for example, if the matter is to be dealt for matters concerning prison. So I was just referring to matters which are coming within the purview of the state list. So prison is a subject matter under the state list. So there is a law which is being governing for Prisons Act. There is a central law for Prisons Act, Indian Prisons Act there. If state of Tamil Nadu is also once again making a law on the very same subject matter, encroaching and touching the subject matter of the parliament, which is already been there, a law is already been there in place, It is so been functionally tested, it is been practically in use. Now, what is the purpose which the state law is now want to achieve is going to be the object which is going to be achieved by touching upon the powers of the government of India, the Parliament of India, by enacting the very same subject matter which are mutatis mutatis covered under the union list. So it is needless to say one subject matter which is already been covered in one particular list need not be covered or need not be once again entrenched by the other law-making body. So while distributing power, while sharing powers, this particular factum have to be kept in mind by the lawmakers. So this is the provision which we are now discussing under doctrine of fifth and substance, which was affirmed in catene of judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court, starting from, for paucity of time, and just referring only to the citations, State of Bombay versus F.N. Balsara, a leading case law to this doctrine of fifth and substance. State of Bombay versus F.N. Balsara, AIR 1951, Supreme Court 318. The next case law on this point is that Vijay Kumar Sharma versus State of Karnataka, reported in AIR 1990, Supreme Court 2072. So the fifth and substance rule applies even when Parliament and state legislatures legislate in the same list. Say for example, if the state government and Parliament can parallelly, simultaneously enact a law in terms of list number 3, concurrent list, but with reference to different entries. Now the court has held in Vijay Kumar Sharma and also F.N. Balsara categorically that the doctrine of fifth and substance is applied for the purpose of determining whether the law made by the Parliament or an existing law which is being made by the state are on the same subject matter or matters of the same footing covered within the legislative premise of the concurrent list, or do they pertain to different matters. So only one justification the concerned authority, legislative authority, must satisfy by saying what is the need for making a law? Is there an existing providing law on the concerned subject matter? If no, then what is the justification of that legislative authority to make a new law or the matter which is already there enlisted under a particular list? If there is a law, now what is the need for once again for the second time to make a law on the very same subject matter, touching upon the powers incidentally once again? So to test this particular doctrine of fifth and substance, the object which the law enacted by the concerned legislature must be proved by the legislature. So to make application of Article 254 at this juncture, Clause 1. So in fifth and substance, if the laws are on the same subject matter, Article 254 Clause 1 will apply. Otherwise, if the laws are not on the same subject matter, Article 254 Clause 1, we can just refer to Article 254 Clause 1, 254 1. So 254 1, inconsistency. So this is why this is the which we will be discussing under doctrine of repugnancy and inconsistency. So inconsistency between the law made by the Parliament and the legislature. So in terms of inconsistency between the union law and the state law, it is always the union law will prevail. That is why very categorically given under 254 1. And if the state law is in conflict with the union law, to that extent of its repugnancy or in terms of its inconsistency, the state law will be held to be ultra vires or void, or it is held to be unconstitutional. So this is what I want to emphasize. The point I want to drive home is, it is the doctrine of repugnancy which take hold of determining the center-state relationship, right? It was so affirmed in the latest case laws, Girnar Traders versus State of Maharashtra, 2011, 3 SEC, page 1. 2011, 3 SEC, page 1. The next case law on the point is Offshore Holdings Private Limited, Offshore Holdings Private Limited versus Bangalore Development Authorities, 2011, 3 SEC, page 139. So doctrine of fifth and substance, we can make it very clear. It applies to overlapping entries between state-made law in the state list and the Parliament-made law in the concurrent list. If the state law is so justified in terms of incorporating some special features which the central law is not hitherto having, and so long as the farmer law does not cover that particular subject matter, this particular state law is whole good and held to be constitutionally valid by invoking doctrine of fifth and substance. So the concept of fifth and substance owes its origin to a Privy Council case, which I forgot to mention, which was in the year 1946 in Prafulla versus Bank of Commerce. Privy Council decision, Prafulla versus Bank of Commerce, reported in AIR 1946, Privy Council, page number 660. So the state law dealing with one particular state subject is not held to be invalid merely because it incidentally touch upon or affect the matters of the union list. So it has to be in principle touch the substance of that particular law. So this doctrine have to be tested based on the nature and character of the law, whatever is to be enacted. So now coming back to the schedule 7 and the specific legislative entries, a very pertinent doctrine which we would have learned in our law colleges in interpretation of statute, which I'm just pointing out here, is doctrine of colorable legislation, which is founded on a catchy phrase that what you cannot do directly, you cannot do indirectly. This is the fundamental bedrock of doctrine of colorable legislation. So now what you cannot do directly, you cannot do indirectly. Now just we'll look into what is that provision of colorable legislation. So now legislative powers, as we are discussing all along since this evening, different lawmaking bodies have been given respective lawmaking powers within their specific legislative field under 7th schedule. So it is meant that the particular legislature or lawmaking body is bound to act within the limits of its lawmaking power as provided under 7th schedule. Now what if happens, it is transgressing or touching beyond the powers or scope, going beyond the powers of a particular lawmaking authority. Say if in case, if a particular lawmaking authority or a legislature is transgressing beyond the powers which are categorically given for their lawmaking with reference to the specific subject matters which I was pointing out in terms of the entries under list 1, 2, 3. Now, if this particular legislative authority do not even have the power at all, or do not even have the legislative competence to make a law or to enact a particular law on that subject matter, it is bypassing or it is transgressing its boundaries for purpose of making a law, and it has made a law. Now we have to just look into the very interpretation of this particular doctrine of colorable legislation by looking into the purpose of this doctrine. Now law says, the very phenomenal understanding of colorable legislation is this. Law says whatever you cannot do directly, you cannot do it indirectly also. You cannot touch your nose by making cross across your head. தலையை சுத்தி வந்து மூக்க தொட முடியாது. அதுதான் the very simple thing. So now that particular legislative body is devoid of making a law. It doesn't have a power at all. It doesn't possess power. Now it is without having the power. Now that legislative authority is deviating or transgressing from its power beyond the scope of its jurisdiction, and it is now going beyond the scope of its power with the understanding that it can legislate a law on a subject matter which it is not competent otherwise to make a law. So which is not capable enough, first of all, to make a law in a respective sphere. It is making a law, it is proceeding forward by transgressing or encroaching into the sphere of a particular lawmaking body. So legislature encroaching into the field of parliament. Legislature first of all lacks legislative power to make a law in terms of entries under union list, but it is exceeding its scope of power. It is doesn't have the power, it doesn't have the valid power sharing or respective exercise of power. It is now knowing purposely it is doing so. Now that is held to be ultra vires, or whatever is not so been directly provided in a law, you cannot do it by way of an indirect way. So this is what the ambit of doctrine of colorable legislation, which was all these provisions were, or all these legal principles were embodied under the landmark case of K.C. Gajapati Narayan Dio versus State of Orissa. The very first case law, K.C. Gajapati Narayan Dio versus State of Orissa, reported in AR 1953, Supreme Court 375, followed by K.T. Mupul Nair versus State of Kerala, K.T. Mupul Nair versus State of Kerala, reported in AAR 1961, Supreme Court 552, and also in B.R. Shankar Narayana versus State of Mysore, AAR 1966, Supreme Court 1571. It discussed on the, all these cases which were cited, discussed on the doctrine of colorable legislation in terms of the relevant connection in determining the legislative competence of a particular lawmaking body. Right. So these are all the doctrines. Now coming to the last, or the fag end of the discussion of these doctrines, as I was pointing out, I am reserved the residuary powers of legislation. Article 248. We can just refer to Article 248 for a moment. Article 248, the Parliament has got exclusive power to make a law with respect to matters that are not enumerated either under list number 3 or under list number 2. Upon state list, concurrent list, the Parliament can make a law, right? So that is the parliamentary powers, or the framework of residuary powers of legislation of Parliament. Now that power is not confined to making any law or imposing a tax mentioned under either of these lists. So suppose any powers which are given for lawmaking in reference to tax, imposing or levying of tax under concurrent list or state list shall not be included within this 248. So residuary powers என்ன சப்ஜெக்ட் மேல இருக்குதுல சொல்லாம எனுமரேட் பண்ணாம விட்டாங்களோ அதுல பண்ணலாம், except the tax laws which are already being mentioned under the state list or concurrent list as such. So these powers of lawmaking, residuary powers, which I was just discussing, the above legal proposition were culminated in plethora of judgments of the Supreme Court. I'm just pointing out some few judgments. Union of India versus Harbhajan Singh Dhillon, a landmark judgment indeed. Union of India versus Harbhajan Singh Dhillon, AAR 1972, Supreme Court 1601. Next, International Tourist Corporation versus State of Haryana, AAR 1981, Supreme Court 774. So just due to paucity of time, I'm just rushing through the next concepts. So the next aspect is that which we want to discuss, without which these inter-state relations will be not wholesome, it will be a nullity. The very fundamental facet of Article 254, it also determines the role of legislative supremacy of the Parliament, which we discussed hitherto all along. So 254(1) says Parliament is competent enough to make a law. Now, dealing with the legislative competence of Parliament and the state legislature, if in case, if there is any repugnancy or any kind of inconsistency arose between these two entries, or the state law and the central law, now what is the power of the laws enlisted under the 7th? Doctrine of repugnancy is very, very simple. In case of any conflict between the central law and state law, always the state law will be excluded from the prevalence of the central law, or rather I can put it simply, it is the central law made by the Parliament which will be prevailing over the subject matter of the state legislature, or in cases where the state law is coming in direct conflict, at times the Parliament has got the power, more particularly in terms of the provisions under 254, to declare that particular state law which is coming in direct conflict as repugnant and as contradictory, or as that of void and ultra vires the powers by invoking the jurisdiction under Article 254. So where a law made by the state legislature with respect to any matters enumerated in either of the list, either the concurrent list or the state list, if it is coming in repugnancy to the provisions of the earlier law passed by the Parliament or an existing law made by the Parliament, such a law enacted by the state legislature shall be declared to be as void, or to that extent of repugnancy, the state law will be declared as a void, and the parliament made law or the union law alone will be declared as a competent or declared as a constitutional. So always, once again, the parliamentary supremacy or predominance of the parliament is ensured once again, is guaranteed once again by virtue of this doctrine of repugnancy. So these are all the matters enlisted there under union list, state list. What about the concurrent list? Article 246 class 2 gives the power of the parallel power to two legislatures, namely the parliament and the state legislature. Right. Now, Article 246 authorizes both the parliament and state legislature concurrently to enact a law. 246(2). Notwithstanding anything in class 3, parliament and subject to class 1, the legislature of any state also have the power to make laws in respect of matters enumerated in list number 3 of 7th schedule, namely concurrent list. So whatever in the previous preceding thing, whatever stated supra under the class 3, or notwithstanding anything in class 3 or in the previous class 1, the legislature of state as well the parliament can parallelly, here is the exact essence of center-state relations. Now, the state as well the center can parallelly make a law, right? So this is a situation where which can give rise to conflict between the law on the same subject matter of the two different legislatures. So this is how the doctrine of repugnancy, which I was just discussing, is lending help or lending hand to resolve this situation. The conflict that arose in so far 246 class 2 with reference to the laws made parallelly by the parliament on one hand, on the law made by the legislature on the other hand. If the law made by the legislature is coming in direct conflict with the parliament made law, now the law made by the legislature will be declared to that extent as repugnant and void, saying that it is beyond the powers of the, or ultra-vires the powers of the law-making authority of the legislature, or under the law-making powers under the concerned list of the 7th schedule. Right. Now, we are now just coming to the present day situation. I just want to draw a parallel, similar situation of analogy of the recent COVID-19 situation. See, there are certain lists under state list. There are certain entries under state list, which had given way for the parliament to make laws and also the state to make law insofar certain provisions of epidemic diseases. So this epidemic diseases, which was a pre-constitutional law, or we can say it's a colonial legislation. So now we might have seen the lockdown, whatever with reference to COVID-19 was promulgated by virtue of Epidemic Diseases Act by the government of Tamil Nadu. It was in the year 1897. So now what has happened? This law was enacted prior to 1950. It is a pre-constitutional law. Now after this law, there is a separate law which was enacted, namely in the year 2005, called as Disaster Management Act. But what has happened? This Disaster Management Act, incidentally, unfortunately, doesn't have an explicit entry to govern with the present day issue of pandemic or epidemic control. No particular word or phrase is so being categorically used there under Disaster Management Act. Now, the power of the parliament, or the parliament now it traced its legislative competence to declare a nationwide pandemic lockdown under the Disaster Management Act by virtue of the powers which are envisaged to the parliament under concurrent list. Now the concurrent list provided for a particular entry, not directly on the epidemic diseases as such. But what is that which has given the power to the parliament? It has covered provision under list number 3. We can just refer to the bare text, list number 3, entry number 23. It is a subject totally alien, or I may say it is a totally a different subject. The phenomena of epidemic diseases is not per se within the power of this particular subject matter of law, entry number 23 of list number 3. It talks about, it is captioned as social security and social insurance comma, employment and unemployment. Now just think about a cynical situation. What is the relationship between the social security, social insurance, or employment to that of COVID-19 promulgating an ordinance under Epidemic Diseases Act? Do would have this particular provision or entry 23 do would have the legislative competence to first of all promulgate an ordinance as such? Now what happened in terms of this particular provision? The parliament had traced its legislative competence, saying that the Disaster Management Act, which was passed in the year 2005 by the parliament, a national or a union made law or the parliament made law, is itself per se made under this particular list 3 or entry 23, invoking the inherent powers under the social security caption, which I was just discussing. Whatever is recapitulated under entry number 23 of list 3 is so being taken recourse by the parliament by saying, in absence of an explicit entry in the constitution under list number 1 or 2 or 3 as such under 7th schedule, now parliament is safeguarding its lawmaking power perpetually by way of taking actions under a legislation in terms of distress situation like this to protect the interest of public at large or national importance, which is also a subject matter which we will be discussing, or rather it is a subject matter national importance where law can be made more particularly in terms of national importance, right? This is the power where 249 very particularly says the parliament has got power with respect to make any laws in the state list or any other list in terms of national interest. So it is a national wide distress, so where parliament has taken this matter by virtue of the Disaster Management Act. So moving on further to the next aspect of the doctrine of repugnancy, I'm just giving few citations before I'm winding up for the day. Doctrine of repugnancy, famous cases from Tamil Nadu also, M. Karunanidhi versus Union of India, AAR 1979, Supreme Court 898. Then Zawarbai versus State of Bombay, which is referring to the imperial repealed Essential Supplies Act. It was in the year Zawarbai versus State of Bombay, AAR 1954, Supreme Court 752. Then Raghubir versus State of Haryana, AAR 1981, Supreme Court 2037. Western Coalfields versus Special Area Development, AAR 1982, Supreme Court 697. Just kindly forgive me, pardon me. I'm just rushing through because I'm due to paucity of time, just giving the citations alone. The last and the very important doctrine on the center-state relation with which we will be drawing the curtains down for the day today is the doctrine of occupied field. This is very, very important. Now, doctrine of occupied field insofar it relates to list number 1 or 2 of the 7th schedule is concerned, or vis-a-vis the power of lawmaking of the parliament or the state law is concerned. First of all, doctrine of occupied field, it simply refers to one particular legal connotation that there may not be any apparent conflict or collusion between any two provisions or entries in the any of the 3 lists in the 7th schedule. So, yet there is no such apparent conflict. There may be some repugnancy or conflict because of the reason. Why so? Because the both provisions are so covered within the same field. Say for example, I was just pointing out the matters of health or matters of any other issue which has been covered within the state list as well within the union list. These are not coming in conflict with each other. They are not going into direct head-on collision between each other. They have been occupying their field with the respective jurisdiction. But the occupying field of these laws, due to which the law which is being there or the subject matter which is being covered by a particular list is also being once again been occupied by the yet another list. Right, list number 1, some particular provision or matter is enumerated, whereas the very same provision, if it is so happen to be there in list number 2, once again there is an overlapping provision as we were just talking about earlier. So if it is so been occupied by 2 different legislative authorities, the coexistence of the central or state laws in a particular area will give rise to a lot of chaos of litigation as such. So such problems, if it arise, either because the union or state, which may illegally or which is usurping the power, as I was just pointing out, and encroaching parallelly into the domain or province of one legislature with that of the other. The sphere of these two laws are coming on clash with each other. So, doctrine of occupied field, simpliciter, it says, no such parallel legislation is permitted insofar as 7th schedule or the matters enlisted in two different lists or apparent conflict arose between two different lists, these conflicting provisions, no such parallel legislation could be permitted per se. So this is why what discussed in the case of Zawar Bhai versus State of Bombay. What is the facts of the case is that Zawar Bhai versus State of Bombay, AIR 1954, Supreme Court 752. I'll just give the precise nutshell facts. The state legislation had provided for some 7 years punishment, imprisonment for certain offences. There was a subsequent central legislation which had provided punishment for 3 years for the very same offence, whereas the state law has prescribed the maximum punishment of 7 years, whereas the subsequent law made by the parliament has reduced the punishment to 3 years. There is an apparent conflict or repugnancy with regard to the subject matter of these legislations made by the central government subsequently, which was already been occupied or which has been law has been laid down clearly by the state as such. So there was already an existing law. So what is the reason or what is the idea or understanding behind the central or the parliament making such a law coming into direct conflict by lowering or reducing the punishment to 3 years from 7 years? So it will give rise to a conflict situation, as I was just telling, in harmonious construction, wherever there is a conflict between two lists. The same ways, wherever there is a conflict between these type of legislations, now this particular doctrine of occupied field have to be taken into consideration, and that law which is repugnantly enacted or drafted must have to be declared as unconstitutional. So this is what the dictum laid down in Zawar Bhai versus State of Bombay. Right. So this was followed in catena of other judgments, landmark judgments, Deepchand versus State of UP, Premnath versus State of Jammu and Kashmir, Uka versus State of Maharashtra. The citations can be just highlighted. It can be just, as in just spelling out the citations. Deepchand versus State of UP, citations are coming over there. Premnath versus State of Jammu and Kashmir, Uka versus State of Maharashtra, Bar Council of UP versus State of UP, Bharani versus Henry, Purchase Pharmaceuticals versus State of Bihar, then Koshana Lingappa versus State of Maharashtra. So all these catena of judgments throw emphasis or light on the center-state relations insofar as the occupied field where a particular law is there already in existence by a competent law or legislature is passed. Subsequent law which is being passed by yet another legislation, supervening or occupying the very same field or overlapping the very same provisions of the law, then that law have to be hailed to be unconstitutional. These are all the legislative powers of center and state. I would like to conclude by drawing the analogy between the adjudication of disputes or the administrative relations, just highlighting the provisions as such. Now we can just say there is some dispute which we all used to know ever since the Kaveri dispute is coming, right? Interstate river water dispute. Where does the provision or where is that coordination exists between center and the state law in constitution? Where is the legislative source we found in? We can easily remember this particular article 262. There is a dispute between two states with reference to a river. ரெண்டு மாநிலங்களுக்கு நடுவுல நடக்கும் ஆத்து பிரச்சனை 262. You can just easily remember. This 262 is just as a fascinating, as I would always point out this as 262. ரெண்டு மாநிலம் ரெண்டு ஆத்து பிரச்சனை, right? So I was just telling adjudication of disputes, why it is so being categorically given in the center state river water dispute or disputes relating to interstate water disputes. So when two states are involved, now the predominance or the adjudicatory scope of these disputes are being given to an authority called as Interstate River Water Dispute Authority. A special act is there sometime in 1956. Interstate River Water Disputes Act has been enacted, where the central government assumes importance. So that is why I was just telling national importance or the dispute between two states. Now here the concept of federalism is being envisaged, or whatever is being fine-tuned in the constitutional philosophy is exhibited by the parliament by way of Article 262. This is one particular provision. If I could draw a parallel analogy of the parliament or the union government assuming the role, I can easily tell you one mathematical arithmetical formula or equation. It is Article 352 plus 4 plus 4. So we are just talking about the center-state relations in terms of emergency provisions. It's nothing but the emergency provisions. We were all along hitherto discussing about legislative provisions. I would like to conclude with the famous cases of emergency, culminating from Article 356, namely SR Bommai versus Union of India. I'm sorry, I have not mentioned or incorporated those case laws. If you could request, I will just post in the group or whatever as such. SR Bommai versus Union of India and Union of India versus State of Rajasthan. These are the two landmark judgments insofar Article 356 in terms of center-state relationship with reference to promulgation or proclamation of an emergency is concerned. Right. Now what has happened? Article 352, this is the governing provision. 352, it per se deals with the national emergency. Emergency are of three types we know: national emergency, state and financial emergency. Insofar national emergency under Article 352, touching upon the legislative premise of the parliament is concerned. Now the president is so empowered, or the parliament is so empowered under 352. Proclamation of emergency under 352 is concerned. Now in terms of external aggression or armed conflict or armed rebellion and all those things, right? War, under these circumstances, it is the emergency provision which gives power to the parliament to make a law, or it gives power to the President of India to proclaim an emergency. Now it is this provision where the proclamation is made with reference to the whole of India or any particular part or territory of India. So whole or India or part of territory of India, 352. Now this proclamation of promulgation of emergency is not confined exclusively to the president's power. The power is so being nullified, or it is so being confined to the terms of legislative relations or the predominant power of the parliament. Once again, I'm just referring to 352 subclass 3, Article 352 subclass 3, emergency provisions. Yes, 3. The president shall not issue a proclamation under class number 1, which I was just pointing out before, 352, or a proclamation varying such proclamation unless the decision of the union cabinet, that is to say the council consisting of prime minister and council of ministers, etc., under Article 75. See, what is that necessitates the president to go and consult. So we are often used to say the president is the mere puppet in the hands of the council of ministers when you talk about Article 72, 73 or 75 onwards, powers of the president, right? So in SR Bommai, this was the fundamental question or the phenomenal issue which came up for consideration before the Honorable Supreme Court, right? Now the president is so being conferred with the power under 352. By virtue of that power under 352 class 1, president can himself proclaim the emergency. But what is the rider which is given? 352 class 3. The president shall not issue a proclamation under class 1 or a proclamation varying such proclamation unless the decision of the cabinet. Now once again the parliamentary predominance or predominant role or prevalence of the parliamentary supremacy is exhibited over here very categorically. So it would vividly go to describe the parliamentary supremacy in India, as I was just pointing out, the federal structure. We often used to say unitary or federal, but the parliament exhibits such a kind of a parliamentary supremacy or sovereignty in terms of proclaiming this an emergency. So parliament has to authorize the presidential proclamation once again. Right. The decision must be taken and arrived by the union cabinet, which have to be approved by the cabinet, and it has to be communicated to the president. The union cabinet have to advise the president in terms of proclaiming such an emergency. So it is only mere an ordinance he is going to sign or the declaring a national ordinance or emergency. So here one may just refer to the ordinance making powers or emergency law making powers, where the parliament is not in session and also the legislative assembly of the state is not in session. The center-state relations can be referred with reference to easy remembrance, Article 123, 213. 123 is reference to the ordinance making power of the President of India, where the Parliament is not in session. Right. So continuously, if a Parliament is not in session, President of India can promulgate an ordinance. Now the relation of the central government is being headed or being vested to the President of India under 123, Article 123. Right. Such an ordinance shall be valid for 6 months. Another period of 6 months and all those things is there. I'm not going to touch upon all those things. Similar provision akin to 123, the yet another article is so there state is concerned. 213. We can just make the numbers jumble. It's a number game. 213. So 213 confers the very similar power mutatis mutandis of the president to that of the governor. So governor can promulgate an ordinance under Article 213 by invoking the powers, and the emergency making law can be made by the governor when the legislative assembly is not in session. So this is the provision 213, 123 and 213. So these two provisions come in play, power of the governor to promulgate ordinance during the recess of legislature. Recently, we have witnessed the Jallikattu ordinance, which came to be challenged, right? The immediate promulgation of banning of Jallikattu, right, before the Supreme Court of India, under prevention of cruelty to animals act. So those things may be just taken into mind as a recourse. So I was just talking about the emergency provisions, Article 352, I was just talking about. So this recommendation, so every proclamation even made by the president, once again is this waiting for or awaiting for the parliamentary approval, or the proclamation must be placed before the House of Parliament. The center-state relation or the parliamentary supremacy is once again being exhibited in these cases. Right. This is in terms of 352. 354 once again, or 356 we want to discuss in terms of parliamentary powers of lawmaking. 356, case of constitutional machinery in a state or a failure of constitutional machineries in a state. Now once again, it is the predominant role of the president to be placed to the parliament to proclaim an emergency in any particular state. Recently also, emergency proclaimed in Karnataka. We may have witnessed, right, what has happened, the Yediyurappa's government and the fall of the government, proclamation of emergency, all those sequel of events. I'm not just going into it. So, S.R. Bommai versus Union of India is that landmark judgment which gives or which discusses the provisions of constitutional failure or failure of constitutional machinery. This is the word. Now, the governor will be called upon, or the governor will be entrusted with the task by the President of India, or rather the governor has to place it before the President of India, who in turn once again will promulgate an ordinance or who pass an emergency law in terms of 356, imposing 356 in the state concerned, declaring that the constitutional machinery in the state is failed. Right. So suspending the operation of the provisions of the constitution in that particular state is temporarily done by way of promulgation of an ordinance. Now the government or the functionality of the administrative or legislative relations are suspended for such time period. Now the center assumes responsibility over the state affairs. So the affairs of the state are being now monitored, it is so being controlled, it is so being taken care of well by the center in terms of this kind of a crisis situation under promulgation of 356. This is one occasion where the existence of center-state relationship could be well established under the constitutional parameters. The last one will be 356 plus 4, 360, that we popularly called as financial crisis or financial emergency. Now, what is that financial emergency? Once again, the subjective satisfaction of the president, 360. I'm just going to the last provision. So the president, once again, if he is satisfied, subjective satisfaction, he may proclaim emergency for financial stability or instability of the government of India's credit, or it is so threatened, right? Financial crisis, right? Declaring it to be a unstable or inability on the part of the government to maintain a stable financial relationship. Here also, the very same proclamation rule is followed, unlike akin to that of 356. The very same proclamation order will be issued in terms of 360 class 1 by the president, which shall be laid once again to the parliament, house of the parliament. Right. So, after expiration of the period of the promulgation also, for continuous periodical extension, once again the parliament have to be consulted. So the parliament exercises its parliamentary supremacy over this juncture. So we have been discussing the center-state relations, how far the center is having the coordinated efforts, or how far the center and state is maintaining a harmonious or cordial efforts. So each and every occasion, now it is the parliamentary predominance in the federal state, or we can say India a quasi-federal, as Professor Beer used to describe in a very categorical fashion, right? So on all these occasions, we say India is a conglomeration, or India, Bharat shall be the union of states. So it is the union color or the union structure which places before the parliament to have the center an upper hand rather than giving the state a primordial or a predominant role in deciding or taking any decision in terms of policy issue or legislative, administrative, financial, any such relations which we have been hitherto discussing all along. So I would rather say, and I would in fine conclude by saying that the center-state relations as the resultant of these various constitutional provisions is the bedrock of constitutional philosophy, which exhibits the color of the federal structure of the constitution, which we have inherited from the Great Britain, which we owe the origins or roots to the Great Britain, which the law or also the Government of India Act also I was just pointing out. Now, state autonomy was all discussed, and state independence was being the subject matter, is the point of debate and discussion, and moved all along ever since from 1960s onwards, pursuant to appointment of Rajmanar Commission and all those committees, right? So, having well said, this center-state relationship is so being encapsulated within the constitutional parameters of the principles which we were discussing all along, and the categorical provisions enlisted under the 7th schedule has given powers between, or sharing of powers between, the center and the state as well. But at times, the recent need situation, the COVID-19 situation, these have proved once again that the center has to depend, or the center is interdependent on the, or it is being coordinated, or the concerted efforts of the center with the state, or the state is always looking for the nod from the center in taking decisions, in making any such policy actions, in so far promulgation of these ordinances or governing the legislative relationship, right, in terms of the constitution is concerned. Now, all these doctrines would once again emphasize or reiterate only one thing, is that whatever there in law is always there remains in paper. We mean to say that it is rather redundant, or we may say it is not so being replicated effectively in terms of application part. So the center-state relationship we all discuss now in terms of constitutional provisions may not be possible to have a practical, an efficacious center-state relationship with the concerted, coordinated efforts by the actions which will be taken by the Parliament of India in the days to come, with to have a sustained, coordinated, cordial relationship, which will once again re-emphasize, which will prove that the constitutional provisions of the philosophy that is so being ingrained in the parts of the constitution, part 11 of the constitution, are well achieved. So the day is yet to come. I can conclude by saying we wish and we hope that the day is yet to come to have a better center state coordinated, a cordial relationship in terms of maintaining fine-tune with the constitutional philosophy. Thank you very much for having provided me this wonderful opportunity to disseminate my views and knowledge to share with the members, more particularly the senior members of the bar and all the people of Madras Bar Association. Thank you very much, sir.
I thank you, sir, for taking us through one of the vexed subject, I can say, 7th schedule. which deals with the state and central legislations, their cooperations, and tracing the history prior to Constitution, and taking us through the constitutions, the trials of the 7th schedule, and lucidly explaining the doctrines that are involved in the 7th schedule, like doctrine of death and substance, then again few other doctrine of colorable legislations, then again principles and principles of occupied field. Taking us through this nuances of this 7th schedule is quite commendable. In fact, 2 hours have gone from the time of commencement of your lecture, and we have never felt the lapse of time. This topic was so interesting. Now the field is open to the questions made by the members. They can raise their hands.
Today, though we conclude one more session on behalf of Study Circle, it is a proud moment to say that a young resource person touch upon the topic of the 7th schedule of the Constitution, even though senior councils even hesitate to touch upon this topic. But starting from nature of our Constitution, backing the legislation background and the distribution of power and the center-state relations, to touch upon all this topic and referring several doctrines, as referred by Mr. Soshanmum sir, that the doctrine of territorial nexus, plenary power, union supremacy, harmonious construction, like this, several doctrines you have referred it, and you have referred several rules, and though you have referred 20 judgments, these all 20 judgments are landmark judgments. Without reading all these judgments, one cannot complete the Constitution, one cannot understand the Constitution. These 20 judgments are very within substance, very basic concept to understand our Constitution. Please, I request all the members to read all these judgments, which is basic to understand the concept of our Constitution. In this regard, I conclude my vote of thanks. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very great. We are very grateful to Mr. Pradap sir for concluding these sessions. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you.